Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Christianly. This is your host, Brad Andrews. As always, thanks for joining us for this week's edition of Christianly. And as we say each week as well, this podcast exists really to cultivate holy courage in you. We do that by looking at issues in our culture through a biblical lens so that you can grow in your confidence to stand firm on God's truth and His Word. And here's what we do each week. We look at three different issues together that I believe are important for us as Christians to know about, to really understand, and to consider what our response to them might be. We do a deep dive into one issue, and that is sandwiched around a couple of other issues that are a little shorter in length. And the goal is to really keep this podcast tight, around 30 minutes, so that every episode is focused and digestible, and it's worth your time. So let's get started. Issue number one. We tend to think of sports as the last neutral ground in American life, but that assumption is starting to collapse because even the game of baseball has become a place where beliefs get sorted and rewarded and sometimes quietly punished.
I am on the community relations team, so like corporate social responsibility.
The director of community relations for the Washington Nationals of the MLB reveals unethical behavior within the management of the Washington baseball team, including religious discrimination against a starting pitcher.
One of our pitchers, dude, Trevor Williams, he is very Catholic. The Dodgers had a group out to the stadium who were drag queens who sometimes dressed up as nuns. He went on like a social media, like, this is wrong, this is my religion, you all are mocking it. Because of that, we don't use him on social. Like, when they're like, is a hot dog a sandwich? And like the players come up, you know what I mean? Like, we don't ask him.
Potentially a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
A story broke this week through undercover footage that was released by the O'Keefe Media Group, in which a man by the name of Sean Hudson, who is the director of community relations for the Washington Nationals, a Major League Baseball team, proudly proclaimed his anti-Christian bias. The undercover footage revealed that Hudson and the Nationals have intentionally sidelined starting pitcher Trevor Williams from their team's social content because he's an open and practicing Catholic, publicly criticized the Los Angeles Dodgers for honoring a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which happens to be a drag group known for mocking Roman Catholic imagery and symbolism. But he did this back in May of 2023. And Hudson explained in the video that you just heard, because of that, we do not use him on social, that is, their social media. Now, there was a time where a director of community relations meant the guy organizing Little League clinics and charity drives, even hospital visits for sick kids. Sure, those things still happen, but now it also apparently means it's the guy who's deciding which players are too Christian to be featured on social media. Now, I want you to think about this with me for just a moment. A professional baseball organization has allegedly decided to reduce the public visibility of one of its own players because he objected to the mocking of his religion. Now imagine for 1 second if the target had been a Muslim player. Maybe he was objecting to the mocking of his religion, Islam, or maybe a Jewish player objecting to an anti-Semitic imagery of some kind. I think the media cycle for the former in particular would still be on fire. But as is the case, and increasingly so, Christianity remains a faith that elite institutions can still have open prejudice against without any real ramification. They can blaspheme Christ, and they'll still get invited to the corporate diversity luncheon. In fact, it might help their career. But the issue here really is larger than Trevor Williams. There is a growing hostility toward any athlete or coach, really any public figure, who dares bring a biblical worldview into spaces now governed by ideological conformity. Back in 2017, soccer player Jaylene Hinkle was called up to the U.S. women's national team, but opted out of wearing a specially designed Pride-themed jersey for 2 international friendly matches. This has been a while, but you might remember that she publicly cited her Christian faith as the reason for declining. And following that and her subsequent admission from the World Cup roster, she believed that her outspoken religious convictions contributed to her being sidelined. You may remember Joe Kennedy, the high school football coach who was suspended in Washington State for praying quietly at midfield after games. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which thankfully ruled in 2022 that his constitutional rights had been violated. Just back in 2024, Harrison Butker, the current kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs, faced significant public pushback from media outlets and LGBTQ advocacy groups following a 2024 commencement address at Benedictine College. You may remember that he discussed traditional family values and a conservative Catholic doctrine. He was reviled for that. And you may recall our own story here on Christianly on Jaden Ivey just last month, the Chicago Bulls guard that was waived for conduct detrimental to the team following a series of Instagram posts where he criticized the NBA's Pride Month celebration, which, by the way, is coming up next month, most likely, as unrighteous. So Williams, Trevor Williams, is just the latest victim. But here is where the story gets darker. The bigger revelation from this undercover footage may be just how Hudson openly described how the Nationals categorize fans into what he calls buckets, using their ticket purchases and tracking their online data. Apparently, a professional baseball organization now is harvesting behavioral data on fans while simultaneously engaging in sorting out those fans ideologically within the organization itself. And the question then is, why is that an issue? Well, once institutions begin classifying citizens by their belief or behavior, things tend to go badly. See, sports used to be actually one of the few civic spaces where Americans of wildly different backgrounds could unite around something just simple, a game, a team, even a hometown. But apparently, modern institutions cannot leave anything untouched. Every arena or sports corporation must become a space for progressive catechesis. So we need to understand something critical here. Hudson himself did not invent these policies. He simply spoke candidly, although undercover, about a culture already embedded within elite institutions. We just happen to find out about it. The frightening part is not that one executive thinks this way. It's how normal it sounded to him. I wonder how many other franchises think the same way, but simply have smarter PR departments. Now, we can't be naive as Christians about this. We must stop pretending, actually, that neutrality exists, even in our sports. Sports are no longer just sports anymore, unfortunately. And the national story matters because it exposes something much larger than baseball. It reveals a culture that is growing increasingly comfortable marginalizing Christians while building systems of surveillance and, again, ideological sorting around those Christians. So yes, the scoreboard may still track balls and strikes, but beneath the surface, the real game is over truth and the conscience, and whether Christians, even Christian athletes, will be allowed to live publicly as Christians at all. The question is no longer coming someday, it is here now, and it's increasingly being answered in the negative in at least one sports boardroom, and maybe more across the country. And now for our deep dive issue number 2. What we see unfolding in certain parts of modern medicine is not just about policy. It's about what we believe the human body actually is. But thankfully, a harmful cultural and medical narrative has collided with a legal reality, and the collision is revealing more than most expected.
In a first for the nation, the biggest children's hospital in the country will open a detransition clinic as part of an agreement with state and federal law enforcement. It's the result of a years-long investigation into the Texas Children's Hospital that performs sex rejection medical procedures on children. Attorney General Ken Paxton says the new clinic will help patients reverse the damage caused by ideologically driven physicians wanting to transition them.
About a week and a half ago, on Friday, May the 15th, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a landmark settlement with Texas Children's Hospital, which, by the way, just so happens to be the largest children's hospital in America. This hospital is headquartered in Houston, Texas, and the hospital agreed to pay $10 million in damages and civil penalties to terminate multiple physicians and establish what officials are now calling the nation's first dedicated detransitioner clinic. Now, this is all significant, but that last part is very important. It would have been one thing to bring consequences upon those who have harmed young people through so-called gender-affirming interventions. But the same hospital that oversaw that betrayal of vulnerable children is now legally bound to become a place of restorative care, to be a different kind of institution, one to help mend what it helped break. Now, according to federal investigators, this hospital submitted false billing claims to Medicaid. They also submitted this to private insurers, allegedly using deceptive diagnosis codes to secure payment for things like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and other procedures performed on minors. And the DOJ says that the conduct may have violated what is known as the False Claims Act, as well as federal fraud statutes and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche in the U.S. Department of Justice's resolution did not mince words on this when he said, quote, "The Justice Department will use every weapon at its disposal to end the destructive and discredited practice of so-called gender-affirming care for children." End quote. Now just listen to that. If you don't think elections matter, you aren't paying attention. Like, the previous administration called what happened at this hospital life-saving care. This current administration calls it destructive, and I thought this word was telling, discredited. In other words, one protects the industry while the other is now investigating it. Remember, politics will always be someone's morality, or maybe you could say it this way: what someone believes will eventually write policy. The question is not whether morality will govern a nation, but whose morality will. And you see that clearly in this story. The largest children's hospital in the United States is now being compelled to build a clinic to treat the damage caused by its own treatments that it defended as compassion. Maybe the Overton window is shifting a bit here. Because see, for years we were told that this was settled science. Parents who pushed back were branded as bigots. Religious leaders who objected to this were accused of a lack of love and empathy. Legislators who sought to protect minors were denounced as extremists. And in this story, the medical establishment, the media class, among others, joined hands and said that we must be compelled to affirm and celebrate this line of thinking. Now, one of the nation's flagship hospitals is paying millions to clean up their own wreckage. This settlement was reached jointly, actually, with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who, by the way, just last night won the Republican Party's primary for the upcoming U.S. senatorial race in Texas for November. Now, as I said before, this is requiring Texas Children's Hospital to permanently revoke the privileges of physicians that were involved in these procedures, but further to amend its own bylaws so that future violations of Texas law trigger automatic forfeiture of credentials. Now, of course, the hospital insists it has followed the law. It says that it settled to avoid endless and costly litigation. And to that I say perhaps, but I don't think so. Institutions rarely confess their sins. They prefer the language of moving forward, or as those being punished in this story call it, patient-centered solutions. But listen, the details of this story matter. This was not simply a disagreement over policy. In fact, I would say that the claims of the federal investigation give us some help here, in particular, the connection between false claims and fraudulent billing. Don't miss that. While I'm sure that some who engaged in these barbaric practices truly believed in them, like morally, I think we can easily see from the Justice Department's allegations that what motivated many of them is what benefited them financially. In other words, it's more sinister than you might think. When the well-being of children becomes a billion-dollar industry, you can see where ideology really just becomes a front for the love of money. And vulnerable children become the product of being moved through the system for financial gain. Scripture warns us about this, that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And here we see it in real time, children getting sacrificed on the altar of greed. Now, the new detransition clinic itself is a confession as well. For years, detransitioners were treated like they didn't exist. And here's why, because their stories made the approved narrative complicated. So they were ignored, they were dismissed, even some were attacked. Young men and women who regretted mutilating their bodies and chemically altering their development found themselves abandoned by the very same people who once welcomed them to partake in these irreversible interventions. See, the support was loud when they agreed with the ideology, but strangely silent once a person with real regret entered the room. The persons who were violated were celebrated as long as they transitioned, but they became inconvenient the moment that they questioned what had happened to them. Many of these young people are discovering that the movement really had no category for compassion for those who desire to detransition. One of the first public faces of this betrayal is Chloe Cole. After medically transitioning as a minor, she had a double mastectomy as well. She began speaking publicly back in 23 about the grief that she now carries every day. At that time, she explained that her insurance would not cover her detransition care, and now she's left with the complications from the things that she did, the hormone treatments, and like I just mentioned, her surgery. But most tragically, Cole herself has spoken openly about the fact that she will never be able to breastfeed her future children. Just think about that for a moment. Adults in position of authority helped a confused teenage girl make decisions that now can't be reversed. They altered her body before she was old enough to fully grasp what was being taken from her. It's truly shameful. Now, to be sure, defenders of this medical regime insist, again, that this settlement is political retaliation. And I would say, in some ways, it is. We said earlier that elections matter. Conservative politicians typically don't use their power in the same way that progressive politicians do. But in this case, political power was finally used to confront an industry that has operated for years with near total immunity. Now, I pray that the tide is shifting, where the same people who weaponized institutions against their opponents are now having to be held accountable for the decisions that they made. So yes, there is retaliation happening here, but it is not against innocent medicine. It is against an industry that told vulnerable children that they could find peace through changing their God-givenness. This brings us to the question at hand: why does medicine exist? Does it exist to help restore nature or to revolt against it? Those are profoundly moral questions, and Christians must answer them biblically. Medicine, at its best, treats disease and heals wounds. It restores the body towards its created design. Now, I will say modern medicine, even outside of today's story, is struggling with doing its best, like abiding by the Hippocratic Oath. But we can say clearly that ideology that asks medicine not to heal the body, but to wage war on it, has lost its way. Scripture does not teach that peace comes through rejecting what God has made us to be. The answer to confusion is never mutilation or sterilization. The answer is Christ, who does not redeem us by erasing our humanity, but by restoring it and calling us to live according to it with joy. I once heard a Christian leader say that the church will need to be a place for the refugees of the sexual revolution. See, many of these young people desiring to detransition will need long-term medical support. They will need advocates. They will need groups of people willing to walk with them through the grief and the regret that they feel. But above all, they will need Christ. And where will they find that? Not in the institutions that manipulated them and cashed the checks, but with Christians and the church who will speak both truth and love to them, who will speak Christ to them. Because only Jesus can tell a generation that was taught to hate its own body that they were fearfully and wonderfully made, and actually mean it. And now issue number 3. Few things reveal the spiritual confusion of an age more clearly than how casually it talks about death. And nowhere is that more obvious than when celebrities start talking about what comes after we die.
Here's the question, Stephen.
What is the question?
What do you think happens when we die?
Here's what I picture. Some of these questions, if I answer them, I have to think of what do I think as I'm waiting for the person to answer them when I give it to them. What comes to mind? And when I ask this question, I think of almost like it's more like a feeling. And the feeling is that when we die, I think there is some continuance of some kind, but it's a like a dispersion of the self into some other greater being. And I don't have any of the feelings beyond that.
What you're saying is we become Febreze.
Yes, right. That's exactly right.
Well, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert has officially come to an end. The long-running CBS program just concluded its run last week on May the 21st, and in the penultimate episode that aired the day before, the tone was what you might expect as the show was coming to a close. It was both reflective and comedic, but one thing that surprised many was that it was also deeply philosophical. Here's what I mean. During an interview of Stephen Colbert by comedian Jim Gaffigan, Colbert, who has long publicly identified and been celebrated as a devout Roman Catholic, was asked this question: what do you think happens when we die? Here was Colbert's answer. He described death as, quote, some continuance of some kind, a dispersion of the self into some other greater being, end quote. Now, Gaffigan joked back, so what you're saying is we become Febreze. Colbert smiled, obviously. He said, yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Now, let's be honest about what Colbert is describing here. It is not Christianity or a view from Christianity. It's a mashup of maybe Buddhism, we could say, on the one hand, New Age mysticism on the other, throw in some modern therapeutic spirituality. It sounds very profound, but only because it actually refuses a very real definition. See, in Colbert's answer, the self is not preserved, but it's dissolved. Identity is not redeemed, but it's absorbed. A person does not stand before God as an I, but evaporates into a cosmic we. The ancient Gnostics called this the pleroma, which means the fullness into which fragmented reality ultimately returns. And that even shows up in current Buddhist-flavored pop spirituality. Even in transhumanist fiction, you can find it. Now, apparently in late-night comedy interviews, it's also found there. Here is the philosophical and theological problem that Colbert's view cannot solve. If you dissolve into a greater whole, then you do not survive. Something else exists on the other side of your death, but it's not you. Actually, recently, Christian Kirk Cameron promoted the afterlife minority position of what's known as annihilationism, which is the belief that the wicked do not suffer eternally, but are ultimately destroyed. In this way, they cease to exist rather than experiencing unending conscious punishment. Now, even in that view, which I don't hold to, it still preserves moral accountability, still preserves the reality of a final verdict. And that distinction matters because Christianity has never been about escaping being human, as Colbert would suggest in his definition of the afterlife. It's actually about standing before the living God as a real person, either redeemed in Christ or judged in truth. So the problem that Colbert cannot solve is solved through Orthodox Christianity, because in it, the gospel is stubbornly bodily. Jesus eats after his resurrection. He shows his wounds after his resurrection. He speaks audibly after his resurrection. He is not merely a metaphor for a kind of spiritual continuity. He is the first fruits of a renewed creation. And that means this: if Christ is raised bodily, then so will those who belong to him be raised bodily. Anything less is not good news nor Christianity. It's wishful thinking. It very well could be what people who don't want to preserve themselves believe, to become a part of a bigger whole, but that could just be a cope. See, what you see at the end of Colbert's run on network television, I think, is the inevitable gravitational pull of elite cultural institutions. Those institutions reshape those that are bound within them many times into something more acceptable to the spiritual sensibilities of the creative class. And eventually, even someone who identifies as Catholic, as Colbert does, can end up sounding like a blend of Buddhist metaphysics and a TED Talk spirituality. But this is not unique to Colbert. It is the default trajectory of any faith disconnected from doctrinal authority and formation. The culture is not neutral. It is always discipling. It has discipled Colbert, and I would say effectively. So how do you and I avoid this same trajectory? Well, we must remember that Christianity has never spoken the way Colbert has about what happens after death. The Apostles' Creed does not say, I believe in the dispersion of the self into a greater being. It says, I believe in the resurrection of the body, not escape from creation, but restoration of it. Not the dissolution of personhood, but rather its glorification. Scripture is concrete on this point. This is one passage, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and in my flesh I shall see God, as it says in Job 19. Not in my essence, not in my energy, not in my vibes, but in my flesh. See, we have to be careful here. Colbert's words may feel like a late-night throwaway comment, a comedian giving a soft metaphysical shrug about the afterlife. But ideas like that about death always reveal ideas about life. If Christ is risen, then bodies matter now. People matter now. What you do with your body now matters. It matters eternally as well. The difference between you will be dispersed and you will be raised is not semantic. One produces a kind of resignation, but the other produces resurrection hope. So friends, be encouraged. You will not become Febreze. In your flesh, you will see God. And that's why we don't need celebrities to reimagine our bodies for the afterlife. We need the risen Christ to redeem them and resurrect them. Hey, thanks again for joining us. If you would, take a second to respond on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. In particular on YouTube, I want to encourage you to like the video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and then hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. We're also on Apple and Spotify podcasts. You can follow us there as well. Turn on the notifications, leave a review. Those reviews, by the way, really help us. Find us on social media. Share the episode there. If you see it, jump into the conversation. Follow us on those accounts. On Instagram, you can follow us at Christianly Pod. On Facebook, Christianly, just that alone. And then give us a follow on X as well, where you can follow us at Christianly_pod. And if you are in the Tulsa area or just passing through, I would love to meet you in person. You can join us at Cross and Crown Church at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings for worship here, where I have the privilege to serve as lead pastor. We meet at Will Rogers Church at 11th and Yale. And finally, as we always say, remember, don't just listen, speak and lead and share the light. And remember that there isn't a corner of this world that doesn't belong to the King.